Welcome, everyone.
Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited to have you all back for another season of the Lunch Break webinar series. Whether this is your first time joining us or if you guys are returning guests, we're thrilled to have you back here. I want to start off with some quick introductions. I'm Mike Muna. I'm the Director of Sales here at LunchAssist. Joining me today is our fantastic host, Emma Finn. Emma is our Communications and Training Coordinator. We're also honored to have our CEO and founder, Jen McNeil, with us today. A big shout out to Catherine Karnitz, who's working behind the scenes on content creation and our Zoom controls, and along with the rest of our incredible Lunch Assist team that's joining us as well. Speaking of our team, we are a passionate group of former state auditors, directors, and just school nutrition professionals. So we know firsthand the challenges that you guys face, and we're here to support you really every step of the way. I want to take a quick second just to talk about some of our offerings. We do offer consulting services tailored specifically to California school districts. We also have nationwide memberships to Lunch Assist Pro, which is packed with helpful tools such as training videos to keep you and your staff informed and prepared, easy tracking and reporting of professional standards, and a rich resource library full of valuable guides and templates. If you're not yet a Lunch Assist Pro member, but you want to learn more, I ask you to please feel free to reach out to me. You can email me at mike@lunchassist.org. I'd love to chat with you soon about that. We do also offer free services like our weekly newsletter and these webinars that you're on today. If you're not already, please do subscribe. Now is the perfect time to do so. Most importantly, I want to take a minute to appreciate you, our amazing customers. You all are really what make this all possible. Now let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to pass it over to Emma. Emma, you want to go ahead and take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and welcome back, everyone, to our second episode of the lunch break this year. And I just want to mention, speaking of professional standards tracking, for all of our pro members attending the call live today and all lunch break webinars moving forward, we are starting to track these hours for you in Lunch Assist Pro, so you don't need to manually log these training hours separately. As long as you're logged in under your name, we'll see you and we got you. If you're logged in under someone else's name or watching as a group, or if you're joining via phone today, you can email support@lunchassist.org and we'll make sure to get you counted. So, as a reminder on our format this year, these webinars are held on a monthly basis every first Thursday at 2 p.m. Pacific time from February through December with a little break in July. As always, this webinar is free and open to all, and each webinar will be broken into two parts. The first part is dedicated to compliance, catching you up on important news, everything you need to know this month, and the second part is dedicated to a specific school nutrition topic. Last month, our topic was updates to the Buy American provision and meal pattern requirements in school year 25-26. As a reminder, that recording is up on YouTube and within Lunch Assist Pro. And since we last talked, a new memo was released detailing how SFAs can apply to waive the upcoming restrictions on Buy American going into effect on July 1st. So, looks like it was indeed a timely topic. Now, this month, our deep dive topic is bids and procurement gearing up for school year 25-26. But before we get into all that, I'd like to talk a bit more about compliance to help keep folks on track this month. We have a handy checklist that we release at the beginning of every month. This goes out in our weekly newsletter and is publicly available to download for free. But let's pull out a few things that folks most importantly need to know right now. Jen, what do we need to do to stay on track this month?
Yeah, great question. And welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. So good to see everyone again this month. I'm just going to pluck out a couple of things that are on the checklist this month. And then of course you can go there and link to additional resources as well. So some of the things that folks are working on and that we're working on with clients this month is just sort of getting started on any schools that might need to consider applying or reapplying for CEP. So as a reminder, the ISP is now 25% or higher. Schools can apply for CEP. And then remember that in California, if your school has over a 40% or 40% or higher ISP, that you do have to opt into a provision. So kind of not much you can do today because of course we do have to wait until April 1st to get the final data to really assess our ISPs. But in March can start working with like your homeless liaison to make sure that they've been certifying and able to get you those lists and they're ready to like provide you with an April 1st list, talking to enrollments to make sure that you'll be able to pull an April 1st enrollment list. You may even be able to pull an April 1st enrollment list after the fact, like, later on as of April 1st though. So just kind of getting familiar with what kind of data you're going to need. Make sure you've been pulling direct certification lists all year. Get those out of CalPads if you're in California or another state system if you're in another state. And I know that the application process for CEP does work different in every state. Next month in April on our lunch break call, we will do a deeper dive about how to apply for CEP, especially in California, where the application process is a little bit complicated. So join us for that. That'll be our deep dive topic next month. Beyond that, one thing I wanted to do is just give like a big shout out to the folks at the WellSat and the Yale Red Center. I've actually been emailing with them this week a little bit because they just redid their website. So if you, it's really easy to use, beautiful format. So for those of you who are in a school district and haven't completed a triennial assessment in the last 3 years, so believe it or not, if your triennial assessment was done in June 2022 or earlier, it's pretty much time to do it again. I can't believe that's already been 3 years. So every 3 years, we're supposed to do a triennial assessment. And thanks to WellSat and the team at the Yale Red Center, they have really made this process super easy. So check that out and get that done if it's due. And then a lot of folks are also starting to organize summer programs like SSO or SFSP or ESY and ELOP if you're in California with all of our lovely additional acronyms. We have a great chart about this that is linked on the chat on the checklist. And yeah, just kind of a good time to be talking to, administrators and folks who are mapping out summer schedules, HR for staffing. I mean, you guys know better than me what you're working on, but these are some things that have been hot topics that we've been drilling down with our clients on this month. And then, of course, planning for procurement, which is going to be our deep dive today.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful segue, Jen. Today, our deep dive topic is all about bids and procurement for school year 25-26. 'Tis the season, after all. Now, last year we dedicated 2 back-to-back episodes of the lunch break to discuss procurement. If you haven't seen these, be sure to check them out on YouTube or in LunchAssist Pro. We covered a lot of key concepts and went over the basics of school food purchasing. Also, hot off the press, we've just released a new 4-part procurement training series in LunchAssist Pro. So for this call, I'd like to review a few overarching concepts that will help frame our conversation, but ultimately focus on answering some more targeted questions to help folks plan for school year 25-26 procurement. Jen, how does that sound?
Sounds great. Let's get to it.
Awesome. All right, so getting started, how do we get started with procurement planning?
Yes, good question. I feel like this is one of those things that is like so big that it can be easy to procrastinate. So one thing that we like to use to sort of get that process started, getting pen to paper, if you will, is this procurement planning worksheet, which is in LunchAssist Pro. And essentially, it's just like a fancy vendor paid list. You can pull a vendor paid list out of your financial management software and really get started looking at procurement by seeing what you're doing now, right? So examining what we're purchasing now is one of the best ways to get started because oftentimes we're going to repeat and replicate a lot of what we've done in the current year next year. This worksheet's nice because you can then it kind of prompts you to start working through like, okay, what was the method of procurement I used this year? Where are my files? What do I need to be doing next year? So some of our best advice is really about spending that time to forecast our needs. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at our past purchasing and then kind of see, all right, so, Is that going to be the same next year? Is my participation going up? Am I changing my menus? How are things going to be shifting? Are there some things that are redundant? Are there some goods or services I no longer need? Like, why do we still have a PO with this vendor that we haven't used? So maybe some, spring cleaning. And then potentially, okay, there's some big dream. I know school nutrition professionals are dreamers, and there's so many ways to be creative. So something new that we're wanting to implement, or a program or a new menu item. So does that mean that we need to be looking at a new vendor, or is it something that we can procure from an existing vendor? Would that be a change to a contract, or is it something that wouldn't be a material change and we can just add on to an existing bid? So this is a really good place to kind of start getting those wheels turning and lead into, what eventually could become several procurement processes that need to take place for several different goods and services, or vendors, if you will.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful to think about. Although, a lot of this is relating to something we might have been purchasing already. But if we've never purchased something before, how do folks plan for that?
Yeah, that can be a little bit tricky, right? So if we're procuring new goods and services, like again, we've dreamed up something really cool that we want to do, and we need to go out there and find it, right? So a lot of that comes down to writing really clear specifications, or if it's a service, a clear scope of work. Okay, what is it that we want? Um, Also looking at, is this something that's going to replace an existing item, like, create a redundancy, or is it something that we can obtain from a current vendor? Estimating demand, whether that's menu forecasting, how many times is this going to be on my menu? Is it just for farm to school month, or is it going to be on every Wednesday? So you can kind of start doing some of those calculations to determine what you need, and then really exploring sourcing options. So even if it's just going to be a micro purchase, you can still start kind of reaching out to a few vendors before you're ready to really commit, and just getting some ballpark pricing, requests for information, just to kind of see what it is that you're thinking of getting, and if it's possible, if it's doable, kind of put those feelers out there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then when we talk about forecasting, just because I know that's like kind of a fancy word in some ways, like we're really just thinking about like, okay, what are we going to need so we can plan ahead? So that's really all that term means, because we throw it around a lot in procurement. And when it relates to, planning ahead for next year, I think the biggest thing I recommend, especially because food is such a big part of our budget. That's, the biggest thing we purchase. It's the biggest part of our budget outside of our staffing, is to really think hard about our menus, and if possible, and I will say, when I was a director, I don't think I ever did this because I was not that organized, or like I just never had it together 100%. Um, but if possible, if you're really on it, update and finalize your cycle menus for school year 25-26 to the best of your ability, before going out to bid. Because that's just going to make everything fall into place. Like, yeah, some of those directors I really look up to. I know they've got their menus all lined up, and then they do their bids, and then it just is all easy peasy, and they make it look, professionals. So
Right. Right. No, then, okay, so great. I mean, let's say we've successfully forecasted our needs for the next school year, but can you walk us through the different procurement methods that we might be able to choose from?
yeah, so let's run through these. I know we've talked about these a lot. So if you've been following along with our webinar series, you're probably already up to speed, but just so we have some kind of foundational knowledge, we'll go through these real quick. So essentially we have three major methods of procurement that we use in school nutrition, right? So, and we're talking federal thresholds here. So you'll see a couple numbers as I click through these, and your numbers may be different because states and localities, like local districts, that may set different thresholds. But in general, the federal USDA thresholds are, anything under $50,000 for micro purchases, as long as the school can self-certify. And we'll talk more about what that means in a few minutes. But the federal threshold is 10,000, but then there's also this opportunity to self-certify for up to 50,000. So essentially, if you can self-certify, you can conduct micro purchases for anything under 50,000 in a single transaction. And then we have something called the small purchase threshold, which a lot of times we say like 3 bids and a buy. It's anywhere between 50,000 and 250,000. You can use this under 50,000, but it's usually most commonly utilized, in that range. And then we have formal procurement, which is more of our invitation for bid or our RFPs, request for proposal. And typically that's used when it's mandated above 250,000, but you can use it for lower amounts. And this is that formal procurement process where we get into like public notices and real legal requirements within our procurement processes. And as Emma mentioned, we do have this 4-part procurement series. Seriously, guys, we've been working on this for 2 years, which I'm actually kind of embarrassed about that it took us that long to publish this, but it's been approved by USDA. It's a really good video series. We put a lot of love into creating it. So this is a great procurement video series to go deeper into each of those procurement methods and learn more and get that like foundational knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point too. I mean, I'm really excited about these. So, how do we pick a procurement method?
Yeah, so I think there's some questions we have to ask ourselves when we're trying to decide what procurement method to go with, right? So there's, the obvious stuff that we just said with about like how much are we going to spend? That's sort of like scratching the surface. But some additional things to consider are, are we going to make a single purchase or is it a series of purchases? Because that can change how we go about it. Are our existing suppliers able to provide this, or do we need to procure a new vendor like we were talking about a moment ago? A big one that keeps coming up is what is our timeline? When do we need this? That's going to really inform what method we use if we have a choice on the method. And then are there criteria beyond price alone that we'd like to evaluate? So again, really important if we are not wanting to kind of get stuck with the cheapest and we want to go with the best, that may inform a different method of procurement depending on what we're going after. And then also, is it possible to use a micro purchase to test out the goods and services first? So even in some really large districts that you would think, oh, there's no way they can use a micro purchase, it is possible to do like a short term or introductory kind of contract or procurement under the threshold of a micro purchase to really get started and to help vendors get their foot in the door in a big district. And then one thing that, again, because we work on a lot of audits, having that question of like, okay, is this an allowable cost? Making sure that it's not going to get scrutinized later, of course. And then are there pre-approvals needed? Do I need to get those pre-approvals before I move forward with the procurement process?
That's great to know. And, before we get into everything else, I'd really just love to get more on an overview of each method. So, when do we need to or maybe should choose from each of them? Under what circumstances do we do a micro purchase?
Yeah, so micro purchases are great for farm to school, supporting local businesses, small businesses. We look at, like I mentioned, trial runs, and they can really be used in small and in large districts. I actually used to say, oh, they're great for small districts. And then Florence from LA Unified schooled me on this, and I learned so much from her and how she utilizes micro purchases at LA Unified. So like I said, it's good for small and large districts, but just kind of sometimes in a little bit different capacity or, they can look a little different between sizes of districts. And of course, every district does things differently. We have to keep in mind that micro purchases are non-competitive, right? So we simply purchase from the vendor of our choice as long as the price is reasonable and it's an allowable cost and the vendor is responsible and responsive. But we don't have to collect price quotes. We don't have to advertise or write a bid. And this really makes micro purchases ideal for one-time purchases that are under that procurement threshold or items that we purchase only once per year. That can also be something that we utilize this method for. And And then also, of course, things that we want to test run, unplanned items that we need right away. And sometimes it can be appropriate to use this when another procurement method would be too much of an administrative burden. The key is really that or one of the keys is that we maintain documents to justify why the micro purchase method was utilized. And within that procurement video series that we just launched, we created some new resources. So there's also a lot of new fun procurement resources on the website now. And one of them is a templated micro purchase justification. So you can just like actually fill that paperwork out, because a lot of times when you get a procurement review, especially in California, they'll be like, okay, so why did you pick the micro purchase? And you're like, I don't know, it was under the threshold. But they kind of want you to give more of a justification. So we have some prompts that you can fill out and can lead you in that direction. One thing I did want to point out and give you guys give all of us a little like brain teaser here is a little true or false question. So if you'll be happy enough to play along with me here. So what do you guys think about this? Is this an appropriate use of the micro purchase method? Can a small rural district use the micro purchase method to buy cartons of milk from their dairy? True or false? Because they're going to spend about $1,000 per transaction and then about $30,000 per year. And let's assume they self-certified for the $50,000 threshold. What do you think? Would this be a circumstance when we should do a micro purchase? So we've got some truths. You can put it in the chat or just think about it to yourself. Yeah, why not? Not preferred. I don't think so. Okay, cool. We've got mixed results here. Oh, Danny, I'll talk about self-certify in a minute. Yeah, good question. So yes, we've got truths and falses. So this is great because the answer is it depends. So this is one of those that, the total spend is well below the micro purchase threshold. So in theory, it should be allowable. But it depends because it's something that's regular and predictable. We serve milk every day, every year, since forever. So it could be something that we do the first year or two working with, like, say, a new milk vendor, for example. It could be okay. But eventually a competitive procurement process needs to be taken or needs to be enacted, if you will. And this is because we shouldn't choose micro purchase methods of procurement simply to avoid doing a competitive process. So that's why this one's it depends. You kind of have a little bit of wiggle room, but especially on these things that you're having multiple transactions every week you're purchasing, it's predictable, you're going to do it year after year, then eventually we need to either do a small purchase or a formal procurement.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. But another question that I have, and something that comes up a lot, is does the micro purchase threshold apply to an individual transaction or to the total amount we spend per year with a vendor?
Yes, this is something that we've gone back and forth on so much, and we were very grateful that in April 2024, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, clarified this because there was lots of different interpretations flying all over state agencies and whatnot. Those of you who know me know I like to argue with CDE, and I got in some arguments with them about this, but we were vindicated by OMB because they clarified what is already in the Code of Federal Regulations, which is a micro purchase is an individual procurement transaction. And then they go on to say the aggregate amount of which does not exceed the micro purchase threshold. But the threshold applies to the individual transaction. So like in that milk example, technically it's not the 30,000 per year, it's actually the $1,000 invoice per week. Every single one of those is a micro purchase. And they've had 30 micro purchases with that vendor in the same year. So every single transaction is a micro purchase. So as long as you're below it for each transaction, and you're not doing this intentionally to circumvent procurement, it could be, or competitive procurement, it could be allowable. But yeah, this is where you can see it can be a little nuanced, and that's where this justification comes into play, because you can kind of justify a lot, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a certain point where it's like, come on, you're just using the micro purchase to avoid competitive procurement in certain situations. So this is also why we love procurement, because it's not as black and white as it would seem, if you looked at procurement at face value. It just looks like a lot of regulations, but it is pretty unique, pretty nuanced, and can be applied differently in different districts and different situations.
Yeah.
Another thing that applies to this kind of conversation, and kind of to go along the question that you just asked, Emma, is this like um, topic of bid splitting, right? So we have to make sure that because of that transaction interpretation, we also need to be cognizant that we're not intentionally splitting up transactions just to keep them under the micro purchase threshold, right? So let's say we know we're going to spend 75,000 on 75 laptops. We can't just split that into two transactions and, just to keep them under the threshold. We should really be doing a formal or a small purchase procurement. And yeah, that's something to be cognizant of. I will say, if it was unexpected, like for example, let's go back to the previous slide, for example. Let's say you didn't know the 75 laptops were going to be needed. You just were going to purchase 45 laptops, but then your schools got broken into and the laptops got stolen. So then later in the year, you needed 30 laptops more. That's not bid splitting. But if you know from the beginning that you're going to need them, then it should be procured altogether. So again, a lot of this comes down to intent and justification, and kind of trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. And, speaking of thresholds, though, you mentioned that the federal threshold for the micro purchase method is 10,000, but for districts who can self-certify, it's 50,000. Can we just talk about self-certification for a moment? What exactly is self-certification?
Yes, yes. And I know we had a couple of questions in the chat about this. So yeah, this is something that you can do if you qualify. And we have a self-certification template on the Pro website. So it essentially, we are able to use this if we're a low risk auditee. And so there's certain ways to comply with the self-certification process. But anyone who gets like a single audit, for example, and you haven't had fiscal findings on it, you can check the Federal Audit Clearinghouse for information on your district to understand if you qualify for that. But every year you can complete this annual self-certification process. And if you are a low risk auditee, then you can, and it's allowed by your district and your state, then you can self-certify for this higher threshold for the year. So in practice, essentially what we do with most of our clients is that every July we self-certify unless they are not eligible. And we find that out by going to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse website and seeing if their single audit put them at risk or not.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Now, when would we choose to do a small purchase instead of a micro purchase?
Yeah, so small purchases are ideal for really when so of course, when we need to do a competitive process, right? So let's say we've ruled out micro purchases, it's not appropriate. Then the small purchase is ideal for times when we really are okay with price being the determining factor. So when we're looking at small purchases, the only criteria that we can evaluate is price. We can't give points for service or points for references, or, we can throw someone out as not being responsible or responsive if they're completely like egregious and like they have a really bad track record, but we can't give points in that same way. So it doesn't mean you have to work with an irresponsible vendor, but as long as the vendor is responsible and responsive, you have to go with the lowest price. So typically we see people using this when the purchase is above the micro purchase threshold, or for reasons we were just talking about, they can't use the micro purchase threshold or the micro purchase method. But then they're okay with picking the cheapest item, and it's, not appropriate to do formal because it's going to be too much work, too much administrative burden, cause too much of a delay. So essentially, small purchases are a way to have a competitive process, but in kind of a simpler way, if you will. So a lot of people call this like 3 bids and a buy. We like to say 2 to 3 because it doesn't have to be 3. You can actually just get price quotes from 2 vendors. There's no rule that it has to be 3. 3 is best, but 2 is sufficient. Still competition with 2. So this is really easy to just call up a vendor, get a price. So like the laptop example, to be honest, even if I was only spending $5,000 on laptops, I would still do 3 bids and a buy because I would want to get the best price for my program, right? Because it's pretty easy to just screenshot pricing from 3 different vendors, Staples, Office Depot, and Best Buy, and then go with the cheapest who has that Dell laptop that you want. And then documenting small purchases doesn't have to take a ton of work. Like it can just be a log, it can be documentation via email. It doesn't mean you're going to have some long, complicated solicitation. However, you might, right? So you might have more of a longer written solicitation to get quotes for what you're purchasing. If, for example, you're doing dairy or produce or even like consulting or something like that, like where you really want to detail product or service requirements, when you want to have detailed terms and conditions. So you can write a written solicitation and contract when doing small purchase procurement. It's not just all about that 3 bids and a buy. That's probably the simplest way to apply it. But a lot of people, probably almost more common in some ways, do write a proper solicitation. And we have a new template for this as well that you can kind of use as inspiration for those more complicated solicitations that you might encounter. And again, just to drive it home, we want to make sure though, when we do write that solicitation out, we're not putting scoring criteria, because the evaluation criteria is just price, as long as they meet the basic requirements of what you're asking for.
Right. No, that's helpful. And that actually, reminds me, we talked about maintaining full and open competition with the micro purchase method, but how does that concept of full and open competition, how does that apply to the small purchase method?
Yeah, so it's really about what our specifications are or our scope of work, and making sure that we're sending this out to several vendors and that we are not being overly restrictive. So maintaining full and open competition is always key in these competitive procurement methods. So the main way we can do this in a small purchase procurement opportunity is to make sure that our scope is not very narrow, and also that we send it out to plenty of vendors or potential vendors, because the small purchase method of procurement is not publicly advertised. We get to pick who we send it to. So we should make sure we're still sending it out to, a good amount of people so that you can open up that playing field and open up that opportunity. Something that might give us like a little bit of an indicator that, hey, maybe we're doing something that's restricting that full and open competition, is if there's only one response, even after we've made repeated attempts to contact potential vendors. So we've done our due diligence to contact a bunch of potential vendors and only one's responded. That might mean that maybe our specifications or our scope of work is a little bit too narrow. And that could lead us down, another rabbit hole of what to do.
Yeah. I mean, what do you do if you only get one quote from a vendor? What happens then?
Yeah, so it can be okay, like the first time around, right? So you can be okay to continue on with that purchase. So let's say you've done your due diligence, you've reached out to a bunch of vendors, you can document your requests and how you did your process. And you may still be okay to continue with that purchase, but you have to be careful not to renew that contract. And to be honest, I don't think that that's necessarily in CFR, but that's what we've been learning as we've been going through like procurement reviews with clients. And that's the guidance that like our state agency has been handing out. So that's kind of what we suggest is like, hey, if you only got one response on that small purchase solicitation, we understand operationally you need to go ahead and keep moving forward and like operate, and that's essential to operate whatever it was you were procuring. But the next time around, it's probably going to need to be procured again, whether it's going to be procured again with a wider scope of work or more broad specifications, or potentially considering going out and doing a formal bid.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Seems pretty straightforward. And honestly is relieving to hear that there is a bit of a solution. And I appreciate you going over some of these more nuances of using the small purchase method. But talking about formal bids, when would it be most advantageous to do formal procurement?
Yeah, so I really like to kind of categorize formal procurement in my brain. Of course, we have the threshold, right? If it's over 250,000, but also it's all about, okay, is there something, do we want to evaluate criteria other than price alone? So that is kind of what I think of when I'm like, okay, is formal procurement appropriate? Kind of beyond the thresholds, is there another reason we should be doing formal procurement? Well, yes, if it's really important to us that we evaluate criteria other than price alone. If we don't want the cheapest, we want the best for our program, then formal procurement is really good for that. And because it allows us, especially when we're using a request for proposal, we're able to provide points and rankings for things like customer service, financial stability, taste. That's really important. Quality, things that are really important to us, while still ensuring that there's a competitive process, because the nature of formal procurement is that we do public notification. So this is part of that kind of like what I was mentioning, where it's like, oh, it's more of a legal process. Literally, you put a notice in the legal notices of your local newspaper. So it's really important that when you do a formal procurement, you do advertise it in the legal notices or the public notices of a local newspaper. And then, of course, we still email it out and send it. And there's ways that we can get the word out there. But at minimum, we have to do that. And that allows vendors in the area to have that public notice that they can participate in this procurement opportunity.
Yeah, okay. So it looks like we're ready to go talk to vendors and get a contract. But in order to really do that, we have to go through this bidding process. And we keep saying going out to bid, but what does that phrase actually mean to go out to bid?
Yeah, so I actually asked ChatGPT this earlier today, and I was like trying to fact check myself, and um, I like I was thinking, okay, going out to bid is formal procurement, right? And yeah, it's typically you're supposed to we're just talking about formal procurement when we say go out to bid. But I will say I am guilty of this, and I've already have said it on this webinar, is like, what about three bids and a buy? We say three bids and a buy when we talk about small purchase procurement. So the
Right.
word bid, all of us probably do this. We throw it out there meaning procurement, right? Or quoting something, getting quotes. But technically, according to a lot of sources, including ChatGPT, it's supposed to be formal procurement. But just keep that in mind. I would always take the word bid with like a little bit of a grain of salt, because you don't necessarily know what does someone mean when they say bid. There's a lot of different ways people think about bid, and it's good to kind of drill down. Okay, are we talking about formal procurement? Are we talking about an invitation for bid or an RFP? And that's what we're usually saying when we say the word bid. And when we look at formal procurement, there are 7 steps to formal procurement. And we go into more detail on this. I think we've kind of talked about it more in previous webinars and on our formal procurement video. So definitely check those out if you're in the process of doing some formal procurement, because there's some specific steps to follow that can really help make this process feel more organized. But it is a highly regulated and highly legal process when we look at formal bids or formal procurement.
Back to that language piece, the terms RFP and IFB, those are also thrown around, sometimes interchangeably with the word bid. So what do those acronyms stand for?
Yeah, so the RFP versus IFB, just, more acronyms for our industry. We love those, don't we? So an invitation for bid is kind of the most straightforward. So this is a formal procurement method, but it's similar to small purchase in that price is the determining factor. The lowest price responsible and responsive vendor that responds to this formal invitation for bid wins. So these are submitted via a sealed bid, and there's a public bid opening with invitations for bid, and pricing is always firm fixed pricing. So it's non-negotiable. In contrast, the request for proposal or RFP really allows districts to award contracts based on the best overall value. So that's where we were kind of talking about, oh yeah, with formal procurement, you can look at factors beyond price. Well, that's formal procurement via an RFP. So there's certain circumstances where we might want to utilize RFPs, and especially if we're looking at wanting to participate in more values aligned procurement, this can really be the most appropriate method of formal procurement.
Yeah, values aligned procurement seems like a big motivating factor. But what's another example of when it would be best to do an RFP?
Yeah, so just kind of a quick brainstorm here, and I'd love to hear from y'all in the chat too, if there's like, when do you use an RFP, and what situations are why you like that method. Typically, I see a lot of people using RFPs with produce, with prime vendors, services, especially services, software where you really want to it's kind of intangible, right? It's sort of about that extra scoring for different aspects. Same with like staff training and consultants, where you kind of want to give extra points for years of experience or expertise. Food service management contracts, where you want to be able to taste the food. um, Construction, where you really don't necessarily want the cheapest construction contractor. You want to make sure they have a good track record, and you can evaluate their financial stability. So these are some places where RFPs come in very handy.
Okay, that's good to know. But on the other hand, when would it make most sense to do an IFB?
So with an IFB, and again, it doesn't mean like, because I see Kristen. Hi, Kristen. Thanks for being here. Kristen said she likes the RFP for milk and dairy. Milk and dairy can also be, I think it can kind of go either way, right? Because milk and dairy can also be something that's like pretty straightforward and might be okay to use, an IFB where we're just looking at price. It depends on the market you're in as well. Um, Frozen foods, where it's kind of like, I kind of like to say an invitation for bid is good for things that are like fit in a box, right? They're literally in a cardboard box. There's a very clear specification. There's not a lot of nuance or, um, yeah, it's not that subjective that you need to evaluate it. Like cleaning chemicals. Okay, cleaning chemicals, we are going to get this quaternary ammonia at this parts per million. We can put that out and do a price for, if we can't do it under small purchase, we could do an IFB. We don't need to do the RFP necessarily. So it depends. You can use an RFP for everything. You can use an IFB for everything, but this is kind of some common ways that people, what they lean towards, and just really from kind of my experience and what I've seen.
That's really helpful to see, and I love the examples. But let's talk about writing bids. What exactly is included in a bid, and how do we write one?
Yeah, so this is a really important topic because this is really like, again, putting that pen to paper, right? So this is a big list of things that we will include in our bids, everything from a district profile to our timeline, delivery information, how it's going to be scored. But I want you to keep in mind that most bids aren't written from scratch. How many of you first time you're going through bids, you talk, or even the 10th time you're going through bids, you ask your neighboring districts, hey, can you send me a copy of your last produce bid? So that's really common. I always did that when I was a director. We still do that now when we're writing bids with clients. We'll kind of get a few samples. We'll look at their previous bids. We'll look at their other departments in their district to kind of see what the district likes to include in bids. So it's perfectly okay to use templates or another district's bid for inspiration. We also have a new formal solicitation template that you can take a peek at. Again, use it for inspiration, customize it, add your own language. So that's just kind of for inspirational purposes. But yeah, there's a lot of legal language, a lot of terms and conditions, and required certifications that need to be in bids. So there's some more resources on the pro website as well that go through like all the real nitty-gritty specifics that need to be included.
Oh, that's good to hear. Now, how do we write bids so that vendors actually respond?
Yeah, and I know we're almost out of time here, but this is something that we really wanted to touch on because, and again, love to hear from those of you here, what's it like for you at the moment, recently getting responses, and where are you getting good responses? Where are you struggling to get responses? Because we've noticed that, I mean, even some formal procurements we've done just in the last month have been really hard to get responses on a topic that typically a lot of people would be responding to, like refrigeration, for example. So we really like to do our market research to find out what's reasonable, what vendors are out there, and then really kind of keep in mind that we want to write these bids in a way that vendors will respond to by keeping it concise as much as possible. How many of these bids are like 120 pages? That can be really overwhelming to a vendor. And excuse me, they might just be like, okay, like I don't have time for this, right? Time is another really important consideration. If you put out all that effort to go out to formal bid, a lot of times people are like, okay, it's taken me so long already. I'm just going to release this for 2 weeks. That's great, but like vendors are people too, and they might have stuff going on already scheduled, in the next 2 weeks. So I would open it up for as long as you can so that you can have a better response by giving the vendors time to respond, right? So like if you can have that open for like 4 weeks minimum, that's ideal. And it does take time, especially a lot of the paperwork that people ask for. Really think about what you're asking for and if you're actually going to look at it, if you're actually going to, sometimes people ask for all this stuff and then when they it gets down to the district, they don't really look at it that much. So only ask for what you really care about, because that's going to take time for vendors to produce, and it might actually knock out some vendors who don't have time to prepare all that documentation, and you might get less response. The more you ask for, the probably lower response rate you'll get.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. That's not something you would assume. But this whole page right here just really seems like the keys to the castle. So let's say we've received quite a few vendor responses. How would we score the results for an RFP?
Yeah, so scoring, again, we kind of talked about this with the IFB as price as a scoring criteria. RFPs, again, we can do other factors beyond price. One thing I want to point out is that price still gets the greatest number of points compared to any other single criteria. But as you can see here, this is just like a very basic RFP scoring criteria. You can customize this. You can score a variety of things. But in this example, it was like 20 points for most things, 15 points, and then price is 30 points. So price doesn't have to be 51% or 51 points out of 100. It just has to be more points than the other criteria.
Hmm.
So this sample RFP scoring sheet is a good thing to kind of reference, and you can even create more of a rubric be like beyond that. So let's say you had, the 30 points for price, and you're going to give 30 points to the lowest price vendor, 20 points to the medium price, and then or the middle price, and then 10 points to the highest price vendor. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing, and you can have a rubric like this. And ideally, bids are scored by a small team of reviewers at your district to ensure that there's no biases or conflicts of interest. So that scoring spreadsheet that we were just showing can be helpful. So when you do get your bids back, you can dish out a couple spreadsheets, have a few people score, and then you guys aggregate your scores and say, okay, who are we picking? And then you keep those scoring things on file for your next procurement review.
That's great. And I think it's really important to keeping all these things on file. How do we stay organized through all of this process? All these components and steps. How do we stay organized here?
Yeah, good question. So we mentioned the procurement planning worksheet already, so check that out. That's a good thing to reference. One thing to highlight is we kind of designed that so that you could link to your procurement files. So if you have, your produce bid and you've done all this work to go out to bid, then put all those documents and like save the copy of your public notice that went to the newspaper, save your scoring sheets and put them in a drive or a Dropbox or something like that, and then link to them and say, okay, here's all my vendors, here's all my files, here's where they're saved. And that, like, trust me, if you ever leave your district and the next director comes in, they will be calling you and, sending you a bottle of wine to thank you when they go through their procurement review, because that's like exactly what is missing in a lot of cases. Or you'll be thanking yourself later, because you'll be so organized if you ever get audited on that. So yeah, I guess essentially it's actually my pro tip here is save everything. But for real, seriously, keep all your documentation on file for a very long time. We say at least the entire contract duration, plus 3 years, plus the current school year or longer, or, it can vary by state if it's even longer than that. But yeah, procurement files we want to save. We don't want to get rid of those.
Wow, thank you. And thank you for all of this information. It has been a lot today. Now, I have one more question before we get open to our Q&A. Where can people go for additional information and resources? Any final pro tips and tricks on procurement?
Yeah, so I did want to remind everyone that so of course, like one place you can go is like watching some of the webinars and videos we have and the resources we have on the website, but this also helps you fulfill this training requirement. So you might recall that in August of 2023, USDA released the program integrity final rule, which mandates procurement training in starting this school year that we're in. So this webinar today, congratulations, check that off your box. You've had your procurement training. Or if you want to check out any of those videos, that's great. So it doesn't specify exactly how many hours or minutes of training or exactly who. It's just it says nutrition directors and any other staff with procurement related duties. So just kind of being mindful of that. And that's something that we'll have to do each year because it's an annual training requirement. So that's also part of our inspiration for doing some of these, is to help you check that off your box and hopefully have a little bit of a fun way of learning about procurement that's not so run of the mill. So hopefully this was enjoyable today. And really, really thank you guys for being here and learning with us. And I'll pass it back to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thanks everyone for being here. And before we get into our Q&A session, I just want to finish with a few reminders. In terms of accessing the resources that are mentioned during this call, everything will be shared in a follow-up email, including a link to the recording. For LunchAssist Pro members, this webinar and all other corresponding resources will be uploaded directly into your Pro account as a training video. Again, if you're watching, we will count you and log those hours for you. If you're in a watch party or logged in with someone else's account, just make sure to email support@lunchassist.org and we will count you. The next chat will be Thursday, April 3rd at 2 p.m. Pacific time, and our deep dive topic will be CEP and Provision 2. All right, now let's get into our Q&A.